muscat, toasted pecans, salted caramel, and dark chocolate. If you're anything like I was when I first got into espresso, you might be thinking, why can't I taste any of these when I pull a shot at home? In this, the second episode of Better Espresso, I'll explain the 5 main reasons why your espresso tastes boring, and by the end of this episode, you'll know how to pull out your coffee's unique flavors. We've all heard the standard rule that you should be aiming for 2 ounces or 60 milliliters of espresso in the cup in 20 to 30 seconds. This is a good guideline and it works for most traditional espresso, but the standard timing isn't everything, and you should be adjusting this at home based on your own tastes and the coffee that you're using. It's a good place to start, but this series is called Better Espresso, not Average Espresso. So here are some changes that you can try that will teach you what espresso can taste like when you go off the beaten path. First up, try a ristretto, otherwise known as a short shot. A ristretto is a smaller ratio of ground coffee to espresso out, which leads to a richer and more highly concentrated drink. So in a typical espresso basket, your 18 grams of coffee in is going to be 30 milliliters or so of coffee out, rather than the 60 milliliters, or half the amount of water through the same amount of coffee. This is usually a little bit easier to drink as a straight shot, or if I'm going with a little bit of milk for something like a cortado. You'll need to grind a little bit finer, but you'll end up with a gorgeous thick looking shot like this. This is just one way to pull different flavors out of your coffee, but you can experiment a lot more if you train your palate to taste the different levels of extraction. So the next thing we'll do is separate the shot. Line up 5 cups like so, and switch them in every 5 seconds of your shot. You do this so you can see what is extracted at the beginning of the shot and what is extracted at the end. Every 5 seconds, you're going to get a completely different flavor profile. So I recommend you try this if you have a coffee that you think you've dialed in, but you're still finding some flavors that you're not fond of. For example, maybe on the first cup, which is pulled in the first 5 seconds of the extraction, you get a lot of dark chocolate flavors that you really enjoy. But at cup 3, which is pulled between 10 and 15 seconds, you start to notice a lot of unpleasant sourness. This might indicate that you want to turn your shot into a ristretto by dialing a little bit finer and giving that water a little bit more contact time with the coffee. In some cases, this might lead to over-extraction of bitter flavors, but if you are hitting your shot timings and you're still tasting sourness early on in the extraction, this might be a way to get better tasting coffee. This is also true of the dose. Sometimes overfilling your basket to around 20 grams or so can give you that room to dial a little bit coarser and pull out more light and sweet notes. As always, remember to keep your ratio in mind, so if you do change the dose, change your extraction yield as well. For example, if you were doing 18 grams at a 1:2 ratio, you'd have 36 grams out. But if you're changing it to 20 grams, then go for 40 grams out. Just remember, you don't have to be married to the standard shot timings. It's your espresso, so keep experimenting. The next thing I want to briefly touch on is different grinders. There's a huge difference between the types of grinder you can use, and at the espresso range, one of the biggest debates is between flat burrs and conical burrs. Of course, if you see anyone using a blade grinder for espresso, run, just run. I've used both flat and conical burrs for home espresso, but I don't think I have enough experience or knowledge yet to say which one I genuinely prefer, even though there are tons of people online who argue which burrs are best for espresso. Perhaps what you've heard most is that flat burrs produce a more unimodal grind distribution, which is going to have a little bit more clarity and a distinctive flavor at the cost of body. Conical burrs have a little bit more variability in the grind size, and that's going to produce more body at the cost of distinctive flavors. I don't think it's right to say that there is a better burr for espresso, and on a podcast with the Curiosity Project, Douglas Weber of Weber Workshops said that it's like comparing a Lamborghini and a Bentley. They're good for different people and different things. If you want to go from 0 to 60 as fast as possible, go for the Lamborghini. But if you want to maintain 100 miles per hour on cruise control, a Bentley's going to do that much better. Flat burrs are going to produce a more consistent size of grind, but this isn't necessarily what you want from espresso. This difference is really important, and a lot of home baristas I know use 2 different grinders for different kinds of brewing methods for this exact reason. For home espresso lovers like me who can't afford more than one fancy grinder, you might just have to pick one and then next time you upgrade, switch to the other. But don't be tricked into thinking that only expensive coffee grinders can make good espresso. I did a review on my channel a while ago of the EasyPresso JX Pro, which is a hand grinder that made significantly better espresso than my WPM grinder, despite being half the price. RPM of the grinder also comes into this, which I talked about a little bit on my review of the adjustable RPM Kopi Diva. I don't usually use hand grinders because my espresso setup's kinda heavy and I don't bring it with me on holiday. But if you're okay with grinding your coffee by hand every time you want to make a shot, getting a hand grinder can significantly lower your entry price point for a good espresso grinder. It's all up to you and what kind of flavor you prefer, though I know this doesn't necessarily help you if you're in the market for your first high-tier espresso grinder. I like my DF64, and you can take a look at my review of that in the description below, but I've always wanted to try a Niche Zero with conical burrs instead. Do you have a preference? Which one do you think is better for espresso? Probably the most overlooked part of the espresso brewing process is the water you use. I mean, espresso is 99% water, right? But many minerals in water react strongly to coffee and can change the flavor a lot. I'm gonna do a full video in the future about water for coffee, but for this one, let me just give you the easiest component to check and fix. That is water hardness. I'm from the UK, but I live in Japan, and the water is drastically different. The easiest way to check this without any kind of special equipment is just look inside your kettle. Do you have flakes and limescale buildup at the bottom of your kettle and around the heating element? In the UK, my parents' kettle is filled with so much limescale it comes off in flakes, but in Japan, I've been using the same kettle for 4 years and never cleaned it with anything, and there's no mineral buildup whatsoever. That's because the water in Japan is so soft, and I checked this with a water hardness reader, which you can buy for around £7, and it will give you a parts per million or ppm reading. Now, this doesn't mean that you want water with no minerals at all, like distilled water or reverse osmosis water, because that's just going to taste flat. The Specialty Coffee Association recommends water hardness above 35 ppm, but below 85 for an ideal espresso extraction. Most tap water in the UK is significantly above 100 ppm, which is considered hard water. Anything around 200 ppm or more is going to start to have a weird taste, and above 500 ppm, and that's not regulation drinking water. That means if you're using unfiltered tap water in a country where water hardness is pretty high, you're definitely going to be messing with your espresso, and you could even damage your espresso boiler over time as minerals build up. There are a few things that you can do about your water, and I'll start with the easiest. A simple carbon filter is going to be the cheapest thing you can do to take care of this, especially in countries with high water hardness or strong chemicals in their water treatment. In places where this isn't a great solution, you can use bottled water, which will have a more consistent mineral composition, and so it will lead to more consistent espresso shots throughout the year and wherever you move to or live. I don't like to buy bottled water for environmental reasons, and because here in Japan where I live, I know that most plastic bottles aren't actually recycled, even though we separate them religiously. So this would be a last resort for me if I lived in a place where the water did this. Probably the best but the most complicated version is getting distilled water and adding a remineralizing solution like this one I got from Lotus. Distilled water has no minerals in it, so you just re-add the minerals in a composition that's designed for coffee. I'll talk about this in much more detail in my water for coffee video, so if you want to see that, you should subscribe. I noticed the importance of coffee freshness when I started roasting coffee at home, or more like, I forgot to roast coffee and ran out and then roasted it the day before I had to drink it. You definitely do want to use fresh coffee, but you don't want to be drinking it shortly after roasting, because the beans need time to degas and get rid of some of that roastiness that comes out particularly harshly in espresso. First tip is always look for a roasted on date rather than a best before or a sell by date. You want to buy beans that were roasted in the last week for espresso, and you'll probably want to use them up within 4 to 6 weeks of their roasting date. Darker beans tend to go stale more quickly, so I would try and use these up within 4 weeks of the roast date. As to whether you can freeze coffee beans to keep them for a longer period of time, yes, you can. There are specific ways to do this to maintain flavor, but that's a whole other thing for a different video. The coffee rabbit hole just keeps going deeper and deeper. Sometimes you're just not working with what you need, and the first thing I look at here is the coffee beans. Maybe you just can't trust the tasting notes on the side of the coffee bag that you've bought, or your grinder isn't good enough to pull those flavors out of the coffee. First, make sure you're getting your coffee from a good roaster, which for me often means buying coffee that I've just tasted in a cafe here in Tokyo. You just can't beat supporting a local cafe that roasts their own coffee beans, and as I mentioned in a previous video in this series, you can then ask the barista how they dialed it in so you can dial in at home much faster. I also recommend using medium or light roast coffees rather than full-on darker roasts. Most dark roasts have a bold but pretty generic coffee flavor, and I only really use them when I'm baking something like cookies, or if I'm doing something very milky like a milkshake. Would it be worth doing a recipe video where I talk about how I make my cookies taste amazing with espresso? Now, if the coffee isn't the problem and it's just your setup at home, the first thing I'd recommend upgrading is your grinder. Most people want to change their espresso machine because that's the focal point of your room, and there are a lot of things that you can do with a better espresso machine. But in all honesty, I'd much rather have a £2,000 grinder with a cheap espresso machine than a £2,000 espresso machine with a cheap grinder. The grinder really is just so much more important to get in a good range for espresso. If you follow these 5 points, you should be able to pull much better espresso shots that emphasize the unique flavors of the coffee. If you're already doing all of that, your espresso could be suffering from bad puck prep, which could ruin your shots even if you get everything else right. Check out this video I made on puck prep to help you avoid problems like channeling and get better tasting espresso shots every time. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, you wonderfully overcaffeinated people, and I will see you on the next one.